Добрий день, я вітаю всіх, хто
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. We apologize for a small technical pause. Under the conditions of rolling power shutdowns, the machinery sometimes refuses to work properly, and Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation today. My name is Olga Atamanova, and today we have invited you to discuss a very important topic. We will be talking about the crimes of the Russians, and International Federation for Human Rights and Center for Civil Freedoms and Kharkiv Human Rights Group today are presenting the case to be filed to International Criminal Court prepared by this team regarding the crimes against Ukrainians committed by Russians based on the hatred. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us online is Ilya, Nuzov, Director for International Justice Desk at International Federation for Human Rights. Also joining us will be Volodymyr Yavorskyi, Program Manager at Center for Civil Liberties, Ovdienko, lawyer at the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group. And also joining us online will be Maksym, Demydenko, co-founder of the Ukraine War Archive. Good afternoon, dear friends. Thank you for joining us, and I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ilya. Mr. Ilya, I hope you're seeing and hearing us. Please let us know if it's so.
Yes.
May I begin?
Тож, пане Ілля, ми знаємо.
So, Mr. Ilya, we know that today we will be talking about the results of your analysis that says about the responsibility of key 5 Russian propagandists inciting hostility against Ukrainians. Can you please tell us more in more detail about the case to be filed? Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. So we're happy to confirm that the International Criminal Court has received our Article 15 submission today with respect to the situation in Ukraine. That communication was prepared by the International Federation for Human Rights with the support of its member organizations in Ukraine, the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group and Center for Civil Liberties, and a Russian NGO whose name cannot be disclosed. The communication focuses on the responsibility of 6 prominent Russian public figures, 4 as direct perpetrators of the crime against humanity of persecution under Article 7 of the Rome Statute in the form of hate speech. So we believe that the following 5 individuals have played a leading role in the dissemination of discriminatory hate speech targeting Ukrainians based on their political views. These are Volodymyr Solovyov, who is a popular talk show host, I'm sure you audience knows, Margarita Simonyan, another popular talk show host who is the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, Dmitry Kiselyov, who is the head of the media conglomerate called Россия сегодня, Dmitry Medvedev, who is today the deputy chief of the Security Council of Russian Federation and former president, and Sergei Mardan, a radio and TV personality. And in addition to these 5, our communication substantiates the responsibility of Alexei Gromov, who is the first deputy to the chief of staff of the Presidential Executive Office, who is either responsible for ordering the dissemination of these hateful messages, or at the very least for having failed to prevent them as a superior and an architect of the campaign of hatred within the meaning of Article 28 of the Rome Statute. So we believe that, and in our Article 15 submission, we believe that these perpetrators are only a representative group of a larger state-sponsored mechanism of hatred, machine of hatred, and they were selected on their positions, based on their positions of influence and the gravity, frequency, and the reach of their statements. So in this submission, we argued that Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine and the resulting mass atrocities that have been committed against Ukrainian civilians have been made possible by years of intense and escalating propaganda of hate, which was designed to facilitate and justify Russia's territorial conquest of all or parts of Ukraine and the subjugation or removal of those civilians who oppose becoming part of so-called Russian world. Just to get a little bit in the specifics of how that propaganda works. So we believe it's not the propaganda that started today. It goes back to at least 10 years ago, at the time of Russia's annexation of Crimea, and perhaps previously. But since that time, when Ukraine has decided to pursue its own path, independent political path, and align itself with democratic values, Russia has decided to brand Ukraine as a Nazi state, with Nazi junta at the helm, which carried out a coup in 2014 and committed genocide against Russian speakers. And these propagandists that we're targeting have made systematic, consistent efforts to portray Ukraine as a Nazi state, and thus justify the need to denazify Ukraine in a campaign that began in 2022. And following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when it became clear that there are very, very few Ukrainians who want to be part of the Russian world, and yet somehow there is a need to motivate Russian soldiers to liberate or get rid of those who are loyal to Ukraine in the territories that Russia has captured. Propagandists, there was an order to portray Ukrainians as, again, Nazis, as less than human, in order to justify in the minds of the Russian soldiers the need to deport them, to filter them out of those territories, to arbitrarily detain them, to torture them, to commit rape and other forms of sexual violence, and to create a climate of approval among the Russian population that these crimes are okay. And that's why we saw the likes of Bucha, we saw the likes of Irpin, we saw the torture chambers in Kherson, we saw attacks against the general infrastructure in Ukraine, and mass deportations of children, and so on and so on. The techniques that these propagandists have employed are horrifyingly reminiscent of those that have been used in the past by propagandists to enrage populations against their targets and to inspire these atrocities. That was done during the Holocaust, that was done during the genocide in Rwanda, and in the wars in former Yugoslavia. So there are a lot of parallels that we have identified between these historical events and what is happening today in Ukraine. For instance, Julius Streicher, the publisher of a newspaper, Der Stürmer, who has, and I quote from the Nuremberg Tribunal, infected the German minds with the virus of anti-Semitism. He was convicted for persecution as a crime against humanity, the crime we're alleging today. Ferdinand Nahimana and Jean Bosco Baraya-Guiza, the founders of radio television Free Libre de Mille Collines, as they call it in French, who referred to the Tutsis as cockroaches. Then the political leader of Serbs, Vojislav Šešelj, who declared that there's no room for Croats in Bosnia. These individuals were all convicted of crimes against humanity, of persecution. Only today, our propagandists are using similar tools with a much more potent reach by using social media, relying on social media to disseminate their hateful messages. So there's also much more the reason to accuse them of these crimes. We have identified several categories of hate speech in our communication, just to give you an idea of what kind of statements we analyzed. These are direct calls to violence, such as advocating real terror against Ukrainians, or advocating for establishment of gulags for those that refuse to collaborate with the Russian occupation authorities. It's the language that dehumanizes and denigrates Ukrainians, such as by calling them worms, zombies, scoundrel, filth, dirt, scum, Nazis. It's spreading false and distorted narratives by portraying Ukrainians as Nazis and suggesting that Ukraine and Russia is one state, that Ukraine doesn't exist. There is no state such as Ukraine. It's advancing conspiracy theories like that Ukrainians are committing genocide against Russians in East Ukraine. So, like Stryker, like Shechel, like the chief of the press of Third Reich, Otto Dietrich, these propagandists that we're targeting and their leadership should stand trial and face justice for these crimes. And so FIDH and its partners request that this crime be investigated and prosecuted by the International Criminal Court in order to punish those who are responsible, and at the same time address the deeper systemic causes of this discriminatory violence against Ukrainians who just want to be living in an independent and democratic Ukraine. Thank you.
Дякую, пане Ілля. Пане Володимире, давайте тож пропонуємо.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ilya. Mr. Volodymyr, well, Miss Anna, let me give the floor to you. So let's talk in more detail about the content of this submission. What were the cases included? Because is it based on cases, or was there any other approach chosen regarding these those five persons who are the propagandists? Thank you. So first of all, I would like to emphasize that, in fact, to collect the materials for such submission, it's worth using the online sources, because so much was said by the propagandists who are mentioned in this work that it's the connections to some specific cases should not be looked for, because so much really was said. And in my opinion, if it was not for the propaganda, this war would not exist. So just average common Russians would never be able to justify such cruelty and commit it unless this idea lives in their heads that Ukrainians are a Nazi nation, as they call it, or are inhumanes. So I want to emphasize again how important it is that this submission was made and such component as propaganda was emphasized, because it remains somewhere behind the curtain. We talk about tortures, inhumane behavior and treatment, forgetting that the foundation of all those processes are the people who committed it, and they committed it because the propaganda existed. And as a Ukrainian lawyer, I work with those who were affected by crimes against humanity. I have more than 300 stories collected, and many victims were saying that those statements that were heard from Simonyan, Solovyov, and Kisilov were the foundation of all those crimes. Those statements that we are Nazis, and during the tortures my clients were frequently called Nazis. So those statements of that government officials were repeated during the tortures of specific people. And in fact, I've also heard, well, you know, it sounds probably as a joke, but the Russians were looking for Nazis in the villages. That's something that I've heard from the real people whose homes were searched in search for Nazis, not for something else. And it all comes from propaganda. It all comes from the television that is trusted by the Russians. When someone over the TV on those talk shows hosted by Simonyan or Solovyov or other propagandists, they just said that Ukrainians commit certain crimes. I've also had a story with my clients it has a bad end. A person was shot to death, and there were witnesses of this execution, and before that person was executed, it was in Bucha, Kiev region. We know that a lot of shootings were happening there. So before a person was shot, they were told for 3 hours the stories based on those various scenarios told by the propagandists. Like, you have to sign that you're a Nazi, you have to say it in front of the camera, and when a person refused to say it in front of the camera, anything that repeats Russian propaganda narratives, they were shot to death. So why this submission is important? Because it's these crimes, hate speech, they've became a foundation for more cruel crimes. But there is a direct connection between them, in my opinion, and for the time being, such a submission is of innovative nature, because we don't know what will be the reaction of International Criminal Court, but we do hope that it will be described in legal terms, as it was described by the esteemed experts, and it will put an emphasis on why it can be viewed as a crime as per Rome Statute. But obviously in Rome Statute there is no such term as hate speech. But I believe that it may become a good basis for investigation and future arrests, and bringing the perpetrators to liability, to criminal liability. Thank you. Mr. Volodymyr, the floor is yours. Thank you. Well, this submission has a number of components, and one of them is a textual component when the public statements are being evaluated, or for example, within hours we were evaluating hundreds of hours of propaganda video made by those persons that we accuse, and we were identifying the criteria based on which we picked some ideas from there, because we see their statements as not a statement of their opinion, but the systemic repetition of very specific statements, propaganda statements. And Mr. Gromov is responsible for dissemination of those propaganda messages, because he was personally controlling that propaganda machine under control of Russian Federation. We know there is a media empire under their control, and in fact they have the same system in Russian Federation, where all those propaganda narratives are being spread through Russian propaganda machine. It's being reinforced by some people who play the most influential role. We've picked basically those people who have the biggest audience, who are the most influential, and who repeated those statements most of the times, and it's a part of their state propaganda that became a foundation for perpetrating a lot of war crimes against the Ukrainian civilians. And us, as an initiative of human rights organizations, Tribunal for Putin, starting from year 2022, we were able to document more than 70,000 messages about crimes committed by Russians based on hatred. So those crimes are only committed because there is some context around it. Ukrainians are being hated by Russians either through religious or sexual or national motives, or other hate motives that were mentioned, that basically boil down to the fact that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people, that Ukrainians do not exist, or Ukrainians are some bad Russians who were brainwashed, they just need to be properly informed and brought back, or that Ukrainians are Satanists who betrayed the Orthodox faith, or other messages that are accompanied by calls to murder, destruction, torture of Ukrainians because Ukrainians are second-sort people. Those are the messages that are being disseminated daily by Russian propaganda machine. This is why we submit this case to the court, because it's one of the integral components of this war. As Anna has mentioned, we think that a lot of crimes would not have happened, or it would be really very difficult to implement this so-called special military operation without propaganda machine, because Russia clearly needed the support of their population, not only because people support Putin. There is a huge brainwashing machine that demonstrates that what they do in Ukraine is justified due to a number of reasons. In the same way, people react to the murders of Ukrainians in Russia as Ukrainians may react to vipers or some other cases. It's a rare case, but in social opinion, or in public opinion, there is a lot of stereotypes, and Russian propaganda machine bore and produced a lot of those propaganda narratives that allow Russians currently to perpetrate crimes against Ukrainians. And probably Maksym will tell us in better detail about this study, how the materials were gathered, and so on. We are about to proceed to Maksym shortly, and let me ask you, how many such narratives you were able to identify during your work? Well, for every person mentioned in this submission, we indicate 5 to 7 key narratives that they were promoting. For some of them, it's the number, this figure is bigger. For some of them, it's smaller, but all of them contain calls to violence. And among the generalized narratives, there are 2 or 3 which accompany them all the time, and then there is a set of statements or quotations that are being repeated in their TV shows or spread and disseminated otherwise. Well, just to understand the frequency of such narratives, what is it about eradication of Ukrainians? Is it daily, weekly? Just for our understanding. Well, look, for example, Solovyov, he's got his set of shows. In every show of his, he mentioned the full set of statements. Or, for example, every evening, his shows change. Or, for example, Medvedev, he doesn't have any TV show, but he has Twitter or other means using which he was broadcasting those propaganda messages. Or Gromov, for example, he was not doing it by himself, but he was disseminating that propaganda through mass media so that people get used to it again and again. It's not like the statement was made once, but it's like on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and it goes through television and internet media, so through the whole network of information dissemination. We were studying the information space in different aspects. For example, Simonyan is responsible for Russia Today, that has a global broadcasting network, a global hate speech campaign that they spread all around the world. Mr. Maksym, I hope you're with us. Can you hear and see us? If so, let's talk about the techniques used for this Okay, submission, thank you. We can hear you. Well, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude and appreciation of this submission. That's really important, and I hope this will launch the mechanism for the propagandists to be held accountable for inciting the violence, and I really appreciate the fact that you've invited the Archive of War, Mr. Ilya. It's very important for our team and for me personally. Let me tell you just a couple of words about what War Archive is. We're a relatively new organization that represents non-commercial partner information platform that disseminates materials about the war in Ukraine. We get these materials as facts coming from the witnesses of the war crimes, and we also collect a lot of materials from the open sources. Reports, summaries, surveys, materials from the social networks that include also the materials coming from the Russian side. That's the part of archive that was prepared during this survey. We were able to collect more than 7,000 different materials transcribed and collected within one tool that helped us to find specific statements in this large massive of information. And I think that it's probably let me comment on what Anna has said. I think that this part of work can continue because one of the elements of those materials that we gather are the list of the incidents, the perpetrated crimes that can be compared with other materials in our archive that we collect from other sources, and thus some repetition patterns that exist in the studied propaganda materials, if they can be compared with the materials that we get from the witnesses of certain events that can be classified as war crimes, the materials related to location of the Russian troops can provide us with additional opportunities for further investigations and finding connection between propaganda statements and certain narratives and events that can unfold as a result of these kind of activities. Thank you, Mr. Maksym. And I'm curious whether there was any cooperation with our law enforcement system as you were preparing this submission. Well, no, the only thing I can mention is that there is a problem in Ukraine that Ukrainian legislation and criminal code, they don't recognize any crimes based on hatred. So we've analyzed what can be the criminal cases filed against those people in Ukrainian legal system. There are calls to infringement of territorial integrity, incitement of war, but you're not going to find anything about hate speech there. So for our law enforcement, it's something they don't pay significant attention to, unfortunately. In our opinion, it's a mistake. And why do we bring this submission to International Criminal Court? Because we think that it's one of this hate speech is one of the key reasons of this war, and it cannot be ignored. It should be studied in these crimes, and Ukrainian law enforcement system unfortunately doesn't want to do it at all. For example, there is no criminal case filed against Gromov at all in Ukraine. So it's a big question, how is Ukraine going to investigate those crimes, because we didn't take all of the propagandists, we've only picked those on top, those who manage this system, who control it. In fact, the network is way more branched, and I think that Ukrainian law enforcement system should work more closely with that, because it's not persecution of terrorists, of journalists as they describe it, and it has nothing to do with the freedom of speech. It's the hate speech, and as long as we have more than 1,000 proven cases when it became a reason for perpetrating more serious crimes, it cannot be just a subject of scientific study, but rather a subject of criminal cases, and hopefully Ukrainian law enforcement system will pay due attention to this problem shortly. And I would like to add that as I work with some specific criminal case, for example, when I know that there were some statements regarding torturings, for example, in our law enforcement agencies, there is a list of questions asked from the crime victims, and among those questions, unfortunately, there are no questions. It's happening for the second time today. And unfortunately, it contains no questions regarding any motivation, any hate speech. People are just not being asked anything about that. And then if an attorney doesn't ask them, it all remains beyond investigation, and there will be no way to establish legal connection between propaganda and the torturous actions. So it's very important to include such question on that list, even in case we don't have it connected to our criminal code, but this question should be asked during interrogation, at least for the sake of protocol. Thank you. Dear colleagues, please join our conversation. Svetlana Tkachuk, Ukrinform. I'm having a question to Mr. Volodymyr. You've mentioned that you've picked only those from the top of the iceberg, and that's it. Are you going to expand this pool of propagandists whose cases should be submitted to ICC? Well, ICC, you know, it's a complementary institution. They act as an addition to national mechanisms, and usually what they do, they work with the top of the iceberg. So it's important for them to just have their attention drawn to this type of crimes, because in my opinion, who is supposed to investigate this type of crimes is the national law enforcement system. And to them we can provide information about broader network of propagandists. Maksym put it in diplomatic terms, but so that you understand, they gather and archive all those videos, all those statements from Russian information space. Even if Russians will try to clear the information space further on, because probably you remember this anti-Ukrainian propaganda started back in 2004 after the Orange Revolution, and it's very difficult to find any information about that, because a lot of information was removed from the information space. And the archive of war, they pull all that information from different sources, and they archive and preserve it so that it can be analyzed later. So there's a lot of materials collected, and more will be collected further on. But again, it requires pretty significant resources, and there was a large group of people who worked on this submission from a number of countries. And it's difficult, you know, to continue watching this propaganda without becoming insane, because you start understanding that it's somewhere in the verge of insanity. It's very clear for Ukrainians, but the paradox is that the foreign audience, they don't understand and see this Russian propaganda so clearly. Some of the things that are obvious to us that are something look somewhat different to them. They don't understand what is Maidanuter or Banderevets. You know, this is some words that exist in our context, and it's very important to let them understand, to bring it to international levels, so the international audience understands this context of hate speech development, that for the decades Russia was developing those hate speech mechanisms, and everything is included their anti-American, anti-European messages, anti-homosexual propaganda. There's a couple of dozens of such patterns that were hyperbolized and intensified. Thank you. We have more questions on the floor.
What about, Chris Sampson here, National Security Media, what about the charges available to some of the Westerners, the British, the Americans, like Jean-Marc Dugan, Graham Phillips, Patrick Lancaster, who run around participating in the lies, but more importantly, they've actually participated in interrogations as part of their campaign, which is something that doesn't happen here, for instance, when there are foreign fighters who are brought. What are the possibilities for charges against those Westerners? Дякую.
Хто готовий?
Well, I guess Ilya may answer to this question in part, but I think that they are protected by the jurisdiction of a country where hate speech is persecuted by criminal code, and it's a matter of investigation whether their national law enforcement agencies, law enforcement systems of their home countries will be interested in investigating their participation in propaganda, because we've picked the key figures of Russian propaganda, those who, in our opinion, are responsible for creation and spreading of this propaganda. But I agree, I can name dozen more people in every country. For example, in Germany, there are people who picked up those propaganda messages and helped disseminating them. And if we watch Russia Today all around the world, they have multiple local speakers who were picking up that propaganda and helping disseminate those messages. And it's important for International Criminal Court to investigate it and to put it as a crime, because now it's presented as a freedom of speech, like they do nothing wrong, they're just expressing their opinion. So for us, I think this submission was an important step that demonstrates that it has nothing to do with the freedom of speech, or it's a freedom of speech that results in tens of thousands of crimes. We demonstrate the clear connection. Ilya, if you have anything to add, please join us.
That our strategy was based on, first of all, the strategy of the prosecution of the International Criminal Court, which targets only the most serious offenders. And so we coupled that with the requirements, the legal elements of this crime, which require that those statements are of the most grave character, and those that we target hold positions of leadership and have a wide reach. And so that's why we selected such individuals as Solovyov, as Simonyan, because their audiences are millions and millions of Russians. They have the capacity to shape their narratives themselves. They hold very senior positions either within the media sphere or are themselves agents of Russian Federation. They're state officials, and hence they wield a lot of influence about over the formation of that campaign of hatred. Now, I'm sure the individuals that you asked about are important part of the dissemination of these hateful narratives. But in our estimation, and at this time, we selected those 6 individuals as the most responsible and the ones that require the most attention, the closest scrutiny by the International Criminal Court. But of course, it's not a closed list. We're always monitoring and looking for other potential suspects. And unfortunately, there are very many because the machine of hatred that was created by Russian Federation is vast.
Дякую вам. У нас є ще питання.
Thank you. We have a little bit more questions. Good afternoon, Rosalana Bachai, Radio Svoboda. What is the probability of the investigation having started after your submission that would have more of a real component of investigation component rather than declarative, when we will be able to demonstrate to the public that all those things are real propaganda? Well, the submission to ICC as itself is a practical document because it contains information that the court needs for further activities. We provide the prosecutor with information. It's not like a public survey. It's a practical information for the prosecutors of International Criminal Court who will further on analyze that information, and we hope that it will yield certain effect, specific actions taken by International Criminal Court. And we cannot still know what will be the effect. We cannot replace the court with ourselves, but in our opinion, this submission is absolutely reasonable and we expect it to yield positive results. Well, let me share my personal opinion. I really hope the chances are real serious because this crime needs to be investigated, first of all, because within these 2 years only, they've said so much that it's definitely sufficient to have this crime investigated. It's more a matter of legal complications. For example, those persons are the citizens of Russian Federation. They do not commit that crime in the territory of Ukraine, and as it's known, Russian Federation is not a part of International Criminal Court, and we try to demonstrate the connection between their hate speech with the crimes perpetrated here in Ukraine. So there's a lot of legal aspects, a lot of legal questions that require answers, and if ICC agrees with all those small legal nuances, the investigation may become just as quick as it was in case of deportation of children, because there were direct statements, there was an order issued by the president that indicated clearly who committed which crime. So that crime was already proven by themselves publicly. So this case can push that prosecutor who is a pretty brave prosecutor who does brave things lately, and we hope that there will be a positive result in the end. Good afternoon. Oleg Moser, head of the Chief Investigation Department of the Security Service of Ukraine. Unfortunately, we were not invited to this event and we couldn't help but showing up. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Well, first of all, it's a very interesting story because one of the criminal cases that the department is working on is a propaganda case that investigates all of the top propagandists, including, as my colleague mentioned, Mr. Gromov. well, it was mentioned that there is no investigation in his regards, so please be aware that there are notices of suspicion issued with regard to all of the propagandists, and I cannot agree that it's difficult to prove the connection between their hate speech and direct threats, because the Russians, you know, in the beginning, from the year 2014, we were thinking they're stupid, and from the year 22, we were thinking they are even more stupid, but it's unfortunately not so. Their rhetoric is so cleverly built that to get the proof, we need to investigate them, and then we have to get the linguistic opinion. And in the majority of cases, the materials that we get verified by the linguistic experts, the experts do not conclude that those statements contain hate speech facts. I don't know what will be the response of ICC, but our legislation says that it's not really so easy. Well, talking about Gromov, we all understand that it's a top-level government official related to Russian propaganda, but it's a latent official, a person who makes no statements. There are no documents that would prove that he controls or manages that propaganda machine in any way. So I'm curious, I would like to ask my colleagues what exactly are the materials that they submit to ICC, and if you allow, probably you can get us familiarized with those materials. Maybe it will be useful for the prosecutor's general office. Well, thank you for being here. I think that you will find common ground and probably set up some cooperation. Well, right after this press conference, the text of the submission will be published. It cannot be fully disclosed because it contains some sensitive materials on which security and safety of certain persons depends. But it will be an open source document that will be disseminated on the website of Federation for Human Rights, and it will contain annotation of all of the sources, how it was analyzed. And I was saying that one of the problems of Ukrainian legislation is the wording. The Article 161 contemplates responsibility for intended incitement of national hostility. And the way it's solved in other jurisdictions, you know, it's solved in a little bit different ways. So we have to talk legal language. So to say, we're open to such dialogue, and of course we are ready to share all of the materials in our possession with the law enforcement agencies, and we will only be happy to reinforce the national investigation system. Anna Железняк, Суспільне. I think it's more of a question to Mr. Maksym. Can you please tell us what are the most widespread narratives about Ukraine and Ukrainians? I mean, those expressed by those propagandists, maybe some quotations, something famous that you can tell us about. Thank you. I think Ilya has a comment regarding the previous question. Mr. Ilya, unfortunately we cannot see you on the screen, but I hope our technical team is about to put you on the screen shortly.
Though.
Yes, please.
Okay,
Yes, we were hearing.
To hear me, I just wanted to respond to the previous question, and I think my colleague Volodymyr already alluded to this, but the crimes under, and of course we very much commend the efforts of the local investigative authorities and prosecutorial authorities to prosecute the crimes of propagandists. We thought that our efforts would be complementary because the Ukrainian Penal Code currently does not criminalize crimes against humanity and crime against humanity of persecution such as hate speech. And as a consequence, it is impossible for Ukraine to prosecute that specific crime. And it is a different crime, although related, but it's a different crime than, say, incitement to genocide, propaganda of aggression, or propaganda of violation of territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. And so it requires a proof of discriminatory intent, but it doesn't necessarily require the hate speech to be connected with the subsequent illegal act, such as torture or murder. It should be somehow related to it, but there is not a need to prove a causal connection. And so in that sense, and for several other legal reasons, it is not the same crime and somehow a little bit also easier to prove. So we would be, and with respect to Alexei Gromov himself, we argued that he is not a direct perpetrator of the crime. In other words, he is not making the statements, but by virtue of the control that he exercises over the propaganda machine, we think that he should be responsible for the commission of that crime as a superior because he failed to prevent the dissemination of these statements. Or otherwise, we're also alleging that he ordered the dissemination of the statements. So those are some of the available avenues of imposing responsibility on perpetrators under the ICC, which I'm not sure if they exist under the Ukrainian Penal Code. So, and we will be happy to discuss potential modes of cooperation, including perhaps sharing some of the confidential materials that we do not publicly reveal in connection with this communication.
Дякую, Ілля. Повертаємося до пана Максима.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ilya. Let's get back to Mr. Maksym. Mr. Maksym, so can you please answer the latest question of our journalist? Well, talking about the biggest, the most popular narratives disseminated by the Russians, it's very difficult to say whether they are a part of the most modern discourse, but the most influential messages are the illegality of Ukrainian government and the fact that Ukraine is losing due to the lack of resources and failure of the partners to provide the weapons. And those narratives keep changing all the time on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's important to view them under this angle where they can be seen as a systemic influence on Ukrainian society from inside, and the capabilities of the Russians to conduct further armed aggression. I don't think that I can give you the exact examples of the most significant statements from the legal point of view, but it's a process that requires close attention all the time. Thank you very much. Hopefully we've answered your question. Well, friends, thank you very much for this submission that was prepared by an extensive team. Thank you for your interest. Unfortunately, during the war, we see that propagandists really play a significant role in this war. So hopefully this submission will become a step on a path to bringing the perpetrators, the propagandists, to accountability. And today I would like to congratulate all of the journalists with their professional day. Thank you very much. Let's continue working together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.